The tree had been there long before I was. Tall, sturdy, and noble. It rose from the soil like a sentinel guarding the corner of my yard. Its thick branches stretched outward with dignity, casting shade in the summer and standing resilient in the storms. My father had planted it decades earlier, back when the land wasn't neatly divided by fences and property lines, but when neighbors borrowed sugar and tools without suspicion. It was more than wood and leaves. It was history, memory, and legacy. To me, the tree symbolized family. I could remember afternoons sitting beneath its shade with my father, listening to his stories as cicadas hummed in the heat. I could recall climbing its branches as a child, the bark rough under my palms as I reached higher than I ever thought I could. And when my father passed, the tree became a living monument. It wasn't just in my yard, it was a piece of him that still breathed. But not everyone saw it that way. Karen moved into the house next door about 3 years ago. She arrived with the kind of energy that unsettles even the calmest of neighborhoods, the type of person who made demands before introductions, who measured worth in appearances, and who viewed control as her birthright. She was quick to point out eyesores, quick to nitpick about parking, and quick to weaponize the HOA whenever she felt inconvenienced. From the beginning, I knew she disliked the tree. At first, it was subtle. Muttering about the shade it cast, glaring at the leaves that blew into her yard, sighing loudly when she saw me watering it. But as months passed, her distaste grew bolder. She complained about roots threatening her property line. She went about the branches blocking her view of the sunset. She even accused the tree of attracting squirrels that raided her garden. Her fixation escalated into demands. She wanted the tree gone, erased, as though it had never stood. She told others that it was unsafe, that it was ugly, that it was a nuisance. But behind all her excuses, I could sense the truth. Karen wanted control, and the tree was a symbol of defiance. It was a reminder that she couldn't dictate everything. For months, I tried to ignore her. I let her letters pile up, let her complaints wash over me, let her muttered insults fade into the background. But there came a breaking point. One crisp autumn morning, I found a notice taped to my front door, a violation from the HOA. The reason: non-compliant vegetation obstructing neighbor's view. Karen had filed a formal complaint. It felt like a knife. Not just because she was targeting me, but because she was targeting my father's memory. She wanted to erase a part of my family's history, as if it were just another inconvenient branch to be chopped down. The HOA gave me 30 days to remedy the issue. I knew what that meant. They expected me to hire someone to come in with chainsaws and grind the tree into nothing more than wood chips. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. To cut it down would be to betray everything it represented. Still, the pressure mounted. Karen paraded her victory, boasting to neighbors about how soon the eyesore would be gone. She strutted around the block like a queen whose decree had been fulfilled. And each day, as I passed the tree, I felt the weight of the countdown pressing on me. I spent nights pacing the living room, staring out at its silhouette against the moonlight. My father's voice seemed to echo in my head, reminding me of the tree's meaning, of the roots it had grown, not just in the soil but in our lives. I couldn't let her win. And then, one evening, as Karen sat smugly on her porch watching me rake leaves, an idea began to take shape. It started as a whisper of defiance, then grew into a plan. If she wanted to destroy what was mine, I would strike at what she valued most. She wanted to take away shade and legacy, then I would take away privacy. I studied the layout of our yards. Karen's house sat uncomfortably close to mine, her windows angled just enough to catch glimpses into my backyard. She valued her curtains, her hedges, her carefully curated sense of control over what others could and couldn't see. Privacy was her fortress. And I realized I had the perfect way to dismantle it without breaking a single HOA rule. Instead of cutting down the tree, I would prune it, not to remove it, but to reshape it. By strategically trimming branches, I could shift its canopy and open her backyard like a stage, fully visible to the rest of the neighborhood. No more shadowed retreat. No more carefully guarded sanctuary. She had weaponized control against me, and I would use exposure against her. The thought made me smile. Not out of cruelty, but out of justice. For once, she would know what it felt like to have something personal stripped away. For once, she would be reminded that she couldn't dictate the world around her. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. The countdown was still ticking, the HOA still loomed, but my plan gave me hope. I would not bow to Karen. I would not betray my father's memory. Instead, I would fight not with fists or screams, but with strategy. As the days grew shorter and the deadline drew nearer, I gathered my tools and my resolve. The neighborhood was about to witness a battle, not of chainsaws and destruction, but of wills and wits. And Karen, for all her arrogance, had no idea what was coming. The roots of conflict had been planted, and soon, the branches of revenge would spread. The morning I began the trimming, the air carried that crisp chill of early winter. The kind of morning where breath fogs in the air, where silence hangs over the neighborhood, like a fragile glass dome. I stood at the base of the tree with gloves on and tools ready, staring up at its sprawling branches. It was beautiful, but now it had a new purpose. My plan wasn't destruction, it was precision. Every cut mattered. I studied the branches with the focus of a sculptor, imagining how the tree could change not only the shape of my yard, but the dynamics of the neighborhood. If I trimmed carefully, Karen's backyard, once cocooned in shade and privacy, would become a wide open fishbowl. Her patio, her garden, her decal of it exposed. The first cut felt heavy, like breaking a silent pact with the past. The saw bit into the wood, releasing the smell of sap, sharp and earthy. A branch fell crashing into the pile I had prepared below. Then, another. Slowly, the tree began to transform. Where once the canopy had drooped low and sheltered, now it lifted, stretched, and reshaped itself like a curtain being pulled back. I worked for hours, sweat running, despite the chill, each branch carefully chosen, and as the gaps opened, I could see Karen's house more clearly. Her deck, where she often sat with her phone and a glass of wine. Her carefully arranged potted plants, even the faint outlines of a living room when her blinds were carelessly left cracked. It was all there, unveiled. By midday, the first signs of my plan began to reveal themselves. I stood back, wiped my brow, and looked at the tree. Its form was sleeker now, more upright, its shade pulled away from her property. From the street, it looked like simple yard maintenance, a responsible homeowner keeping a tree healthy. But from her side of the fence, it was something far different. It was exposure. Karen noticed almost immediately. I caught her peeking through her blinds as I hauled branches into a pile. Her lips tightened, her eyes narrowed. She didn't say anything. Not yet, but I could feel the tension in her glare. It was the look of someone sensing that control was slipping, though she couldn't quite name how. The days that followed revealed the brilliance of the plan. With the tree trimmed, her backyard was no longer secluded. From the street, neighbors could now see her patio. From my own yard, I could glimpse her activities with startling clarity. The once shadowed corners where she lounged in secret now basked in open sunlight. Privacy she had taken for granted evaporated in a matter of days. At first, she tried to ignore it. She carried on with her routines, watering plants, sitting on her deck, scrolling through her phone. But there was a change. Her movements became sharper. More courteous, she shifted in her chair more often, glanced around, pulled her robe tighter when she stepped outside. The comfort of being unseen had been stolen from her, and it gnawed at her. Then came the adjustments. She hung new curtains, thicker and darker. She planted fast-growing shrubs along the fence line, desperate to rebuild the walls she had lost. She even ordered an umbrella to cover her patio furniture, as though shade could substitute for privacy. But the efforts were flimsy. Almost pathetic. The tree had shifted the balance, and no curtain or hedge could undo it. The HOA, of course, was silent. On paper, I had complied with their demand. The violation had said remedy the issue. I had trimmed the tree, made it more compliant, and even beautified my yard in the process. There was nothing they could say, no rule they could twist, no threat they could make. I had outmaneuvered them, and Karen knew it. Her frustration began to bubble over. I noticed her pacing her yard at odd hours, muttering under her breath, snapping at delivery drivers. She started confronting other neighbors, complaining about noise, parking, and children playing too close to her fence. But each time the neighbors gave her less sympathy. They had watched the spectacle of her crusade against me. They had seen how petty and vindictive she had become. And now, with her own life suddenly on display, her authority crumbled further. One evening, as the sun set and the tree's reshaped canopy cast long shadows across her lawn, I stood on my porch and watched her. She was sitting stiffly on her deck, sipping from a wine glass, eyes darting nervously to the street. A couple walking their dog strolled by and glanced in her direction. It was casual, innocent, but Karen flinched, as if struck. Her sanctuary was gone, and I realized then that this wasn't just revenge. It was justice. She had tried to erase a piece of my family's history, to force me to cut down a living connection to my father. Instead, she had lost something just as valuable to her illusion of power. She had always believed she could control the neighborhood from behind her fortress of privacy, but now she was the one exposed, vulnerable, and powerless. Still, I knew Karen wouldn't give up easily. She was too stubborn, too addicted to control, to accept defeat. If the pruning had shaken her, then her retaliation was inevitable. The question wasn't if she would strike back, but how. As I cleaned up the last pile of branches that evening, I glanced once more at her darkened windows. I could feel her eyes behind them, watching me. See, the war between us wasn't over, it had only shifted. The tree now stood taller, prouder, and more defiant than ever. And like the tree, I was ready to stand firm. Whatever Karen planned next, I would be ready. The first battle was mine, but the real war had only begun. Karen's pride had always been her armor, and when that armor cracked, she didn't retreat, she lashed out. The weeks after the trimming revealed just how far she was willing to go to claw back her sense of control. At first, it began with whispers, complaints murmured at HOA meetings, carefully framed as concerns for the neighborhood. She painted me as reckless, claiming my tree was still a danger, that falling branches threatened her safety, that my trimming had made it unstable. Her words slithered into the ears of the HOA board, who nodded solemnly as if they were listening to wisdom rather than paranoia. Soon, letters began arriving in my mailbox again. Failure to properly maintain property. Obstruction of neighborhood harmony. Each envelope bore the HOA's seal, each line dripping with vague threats of fines and legal action. They never said I had broken a rule they couldn't, but they hinted at it, pressing down with the weight of bureaucracy. It was Karen's way of striking back, of weaponizing the system she had always used, like a hammer. If they couldn't win with privacy, she would win with paperwork. But what Karen didn't realize was that the neighborhood was watching. They had seen her theatrics, her obsession, her endless knit. The more she escalated, the less sympathy she received. Neighbors began rolling their eyes when she spoke, muttering under their breath when she strutted past. The power she once wielded so easily slipped from her fingers, like sand she couldn't hold on to no matter how tightly she grasped. Still, her determination only grew. She started snapping pictures of my yard, lurking near the fence with her phone aimed like a weapon. She took photos of my trash cans, of my lawn, even of me standing on my porch. Then she would march into HOA meetings, waving the images as proof of my supposed violations. The absurdity of it all became clear when she submitted a complaint about the color of my mailbox, insisting it was too faded to meet community standards. The board grew weary, but they were bound by procedure. Each complaint had to be processed, each hearing scheduled, each letter sent. And so, my days became a cycle of defending myself against baseless accusations, standing firm as Karen tried to drown me in paperwork. But beneath her fury, I could sense something deeper. Her backyard, once her fortress, was now a stage. Every time she stepped outside, she felt the eyes of the neighborhood on her, real or imagined. She had lost the privacy she once took for granted, and no amount of curtain drawing or shrub planting could restore it. Her obsession with me wasn't just about the tree anymore, it was about the humiliation of being exposed. And humiliation has a way of warping into desperation. One night, I was woken by the sound of rustling outside. I stepped quietly to the window, peering into the moonlit yard. At first, I saw nothing. Then, movement, a figure, hunched near the base of the tree. My heart thudded as I recognized the outline. Karen. She was fumbling with something in her hand, small bottles, the kind you'd find in a gardening shed. Herbicide. The realization struck like lightning. She wasn't just filing complaints anymore. She was attempting to kill the tree outright. I rushed outside, my footsteps crunching against the grass. By the time I reached the fence, she had retreated, scurrying into her house like a rat caught in the open. But the evidence was clear: dark stains near the roots. The acrid smell of chemicals clinging to the soil. Rage surged through me, hotter than I'd ever felt. It wasn't just about the tree anymore, it was about the violation, the audacity, the cruelty of attacking something sacred. She hadn't just tried to control me, she had tried to erase the last living piece of my father. The next morning, I acted quickly. I contacted an arborist who confirmed what I already feared. The chemicals had seeped into the soil, threatening the health of the tree. But the arborist also gave me hope. With care, with treatment, the tree could survive. It would take time, but it was possible. Karen had tried to end it, but she had failed. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Neighbors who had once stayed silent began to speak out. They were disgusted, horrified that she would go so far. Some even offered to help, showing up with shovels and soil treatments, standing beside me as we worked to save the tree. It was no longer just my fight, it had become a community. Stand against her tyranny, and Karen, for all her venom, began to shrink. She still filed complaints, still muttered insults, still sent glares sharp as knives. But her actions had cost her more than she realized. The neighborhood no longer saw her as powerful. They saw her as petty, cruel, and dangerous. Still, I knew she wasn't done. Someone like Karen didn't stop because of shame or isolation. She stopped only when she was forced to. And though the tree stood taller than her spite, I could feel the storm still building. One evening, as I watered the roots and spread fresh soil, I looked up at the branches silhouetted against the setting sun. They swayed gently in the breeze, defiant and alive. I realized then that the battle wasn't just about me or Karen anymore. It was about legacy, resilience, and community. Karen had declared war. But she hadn't just picked a fight with me. She had picked a fight with history, with roots that ran deeper than her shallow grievances, with a neighborhood no longer willing to bend. The pruning had exposed her. The retaliation had revealed her desperation. But the real confrontation, the moment everything would come to a head, was still ahead. And when it came, I knew one thing for certain. I would be ready. The letters came with an air of finality, sealed envelopes stamped with the HOA's insignia and an unnerving formality. Each one was heavier than the last, their wording colder, their tone official. Notice of violation, demand for compliance, failure to remediate. Karen had finally managed to twist procedure into a weapon sharp enough to slice through ordinary patience. She had pushed the HOA into the role she always wanted for herself: judge, jury, and enforcer. The board, once hesitant, now parroted procedural language and deadlines as though reciting a script she'd written for them. The message was clear: cut the tree down, or face fines, liens, and legal action. The ultimatum landed across my porch like a thunderclap. The deadline carved a hollow in the calendar, and neighbors who'd once nodded politely now watched with a breath held between sympathy and curiosity. It felt as if the machinery of bureaucracy had been set in motion specifically to erase something that had stood through generations. That realization made the stakes personal and impossible to ignore. I spent the night reading and rereading the notices, tracing each clause for loopholes, each phrase for room to breathe. There was cruelty in the language, an attempt to sanitize vengeance with legalese, but behind the letters was a truth the HOA couldn't legislate away. The tree had roots that ran deeper than violence. It was memory and belonging, and it could not be reduced to non-compliant vegetation without consequence. Rather than panic, a slow clarity set in. Karen had escalated to the place she always used when petty measures failed. She had weaponized institutions. The only way to meet that was with structure of my own. Evidence, witnesses, experts, and the kind of documentation that could withstand formal scrutiny. I would not be bullied into destroying my father's legacy because one person chose to fold power into procedure. If she wanted a legal fight, then I would answer with facts and community support. The first step was the arborist's report. I arranged for a certified tree care specialist to examine the roots, the trunk, and the overall health of the specimen. The arborist walked the property with professional calm, measuring, testing, soil, tapping the bark, and peering into the canopy. Days later, the written assessment arrived in a neat folder. The tree was structurally sound, the earlier chemical damage had been mitigated through treatment, and the recommended actions were maintenance and preservation, not removal. The report used terms that carried weight in hearings and bureaucratic meetings. No imminent hazard, root integrity intact, valuable specimen, and a quantified estimate of ecological and property value. It was the kind of document that turned passion into irrefutable record. Next came neighbors. The quiet solidarity that had grown since the early trimming found a new focus. People who had watched the drama unfold began to step forward, offering statements and memories. Mrs. Patel across the street remembered the tree from when her children were small. The Hendersons recalled block parties under its branches. A young couple who'd recently moved in sent an email describing how the tree's shade had shaped their decision to buy the house. These weren't dramatic testimonies. They were the accumulation of small truths that, when assembled, formed a living archive. I requested written statements and backed them up with photos from family albums and old community newsletters that had pictured the tree in various seasons. History has a way of proving itself when given a paper trail. I documented Karen's behavior too. Her complaint to the HOA, the anonymous notes, the late-night prowling at the tree's base. Each incident was recorded, dated, and saved. Security camera footage, once installed around my yard, became a ledger of her patterns. I had recordings of her pacing outside, her phone cameras trained on the branches, her furtive movements near the routes that culminated in the herbicide attempt. The footage was clinical and damning. It turned suspicion into evidence that could be shared with the board, with legal counsel, and, if necessary, with authorities. Then came the lawyer. It was an ordinary meeting in a downtown office, but the words in that room felt heavy with potential. The attorney read the arborist's report, skimmed the neighbor statements, and reviewed the video evidence. He explained how HOAs operate under specific constraints, and how they could be held accountable if their rulings were arbitrary or maliciously motivated. He talked about defamation, about the misuse of complaint processes, about the legal peril of filing false reports and the remedies available to someone targeted by a neighbor's vendetta. He did not promise a cinematic courtroom showdown. He promised a methodical, procedural dismantling of Karen's leverage. Legal attention, he advised, often has a sobering effect on those who previously acted with impunity. While the legal strategy took shape, so did a plan to shift the narrative in the court of public opinion. Karen's power was partly rooted in perception. If she seemed reasonable, if she could frame herself as the defender of standards, neighbors might align with her. The countermeasure was community-facing. An informational leaflet about the tree's history, copies of the arborist's findings, and a clear timeline of events that contrasted evidence with accusation. The aim wasn't to humiliate, but to reveal a balanced truth. The leaflets were distributed with care, not as a weapon but as a mirror held up to the facts. As the preparations advanced, the HOA scheduled a hearing. The meeting notice was pinned to the community board, printed in stern font, and set for a Tuesday evening when most neighbors could attend. It would be the legal battleground Karen had demanded, and it would be the place where our paper trail, witnesses, and reports would either stand or crumble. The board's choice of time, the choreographed ritual of committee and quorum, felt almost theatrical. That was fine. If she wanted a stage, we would bring the script. On the day of the hearing, there was a low electric hum in the neighborhood. People spoke in small clusters, more resolute than nervous. The rumor mill had churned, but now there was purpose behind the chatter. I entered the community center with the arborist's folder under my arm, the neighbor's statements in a binder, and the attorney's calm assurance tucked like armor in my pocket. The room smelled faintly of coffee and paper and the sort of officialdom that can feel both oppressive and strangely liberating. The hearing itself was procedural and exhausting, a choreography of testimony and objection. Karen, predictably, presented her case with the same force she had applied in quieter settings: voice, sharp, timing, precise, accusations rehearsed. But this time, she faced certified expertise. The arborist spoke of preservation. The attorney explained legal obligations of fair treatment. Neighbors recounted decades of shared memory. Evidence neutralized rhetoric. The board, which had once seemed like a conspirator, found itself facing the hard truth of documentation. In that meeting, an underside of the HOA exposed itself. The board's initial eagerness to act had not been rooted in wisdom but in convenience, a willingness to accept complaints as proof without scrutiny. Faced with authenticated reports and a neighborhood united, the board faltered. The legal counsel's words about liability for wrongful enforcement and potential damages wove an invisible but potent thread that tightened around any reckless desire to impose fines. When the meeting closed, the decision was not a triumphant declaration, but a quiet, bureaucratic correction. No removal required, monitoring and maintenance recommended, and stern admonitions against harassment for any neighbor found to be sabotaging property. It was a victory that arrived in pages of minutes and formal language. It was the kind of win that mattered in the long run, binding, recorded, and enforceable. Walking home afterward, the weight of the fight didn't vanish. The victory at the HOA hearing was important, but it had also sharpened Karen's edges. She had been pushed back, but not broken. The legal steps had forced her hand, yet pride has a strange elasticity. My counterattack had succeeded for now, but the war had entered a new phase, one governed by law, by reputation, and by the slow machinery of accountability. As twilight fell, I stood beneath the tree's spreading canopy, feeling the evening breeze stir the newly pruned leaves. The tree, survivor of human pettiness, rustled like a satisfied audience. The branches, trimmed but intact, held memories and witness. The battle lines were drawn not with axes and swords, but with reports and witness statements, with community solidarity and the steady hand of the law. Karen had sought to weaponize privacy and procedure. I had responded with open documentation and communal resolve. The outcome of the HOA hearing was a hinge. It swung the neighborhood back towards sanity, but it did not end the story. There was still a sense of unfinished business in the air, a whisper that what had been won could always be tested again. The season had turned, and with it the fight had evolved. The next move, I suspected, would come not from the board, but from the woman herself, now cornered, now more dangerous in her unpredictability than in her prior arrogance. I felt the adrenaline mix with weariness, the knowledge that justice can be patient, but that some adversaries are not. The tree stood, for now, tall and defiant, but the branches of conflict still stretched into days ahead. The natural break arrived like a rustle in the Lisa hush, before whatever came next. The chapter closed on the quiet certainty that those who seek to erase history will sometimes summon forces they cannot control. The next chapter would reveal whether Karen would accept the limits imposed by law and community, or whether she would escalate into something darker, something that would test the neighborhood's resolve in unexpected ways. The decision from the HOA should have been the end. A clear ruling had been issued, the evidence was in writing, and the community had spoken with one voice. For anyone else, that would have been enough. But Karen was not anyone else. To her, the decision was not closure, it was humiliation. And humiliation, in her mind, was a debt that demanded repayment. The signs of her brewing retaliation began almost immediately. Where once her anger had been funneled through committees and complaint letters, it now leaked out in quieter, sharper ways. Small acts, designed to annoy, began to multiply. Trash cans tipped just far enough to spill their contents into my driveway. Anonymous flyers appeared in mailboxes, warning that my tree was a ticking time bomb poised to collapse and destroy homes. The edges of my yard, once neat and untouched, bore the faint lines of someone spraying weed killer just inside the property line. Karen had been denied the satisfaction of a public win, but she was determined to take her pound of flesh in whispers and rumors. It was a different kind of warfare, more insidious than official letters. This was the conflict stripped of rules, fought in alleys and shadows rather than meeting halls. It wasn't about the tree anymore, it was about pride, control, and the image she held of herself as the neighborhood's ruler. But she had underestimated something crucial. The neighborhood's patience had worn thin. Where once people turned a blind eye to her antics, now they recognized the pattern. The flyers were mocked, the trash can incidents were caught on security footage, and whispers spread not about my supposed negligence, but about her obsession. The more she tried to chip away at my standing, the more isolated she became, and that isolation fueled her rage even further. I knew better than to rely only on defense. A passive stance would invite endless harassment. If Karen wanted to escalate, then the counterstrike would have to evolve not just through legal channels but through exposure. Her tactics relied on secrecy, on the assumption that people wouldn't connect the dots. My goal was to draw every one of her shadows into the open, to let the community see her as she really was. The first step was transparency. I gathered all the security footage, the flyers, the chemical residue tests from my soil, and compiled them into a comprehensive record. But rather than submit it quietly to the HOA, which she could dismiss as more red tape, I shared it with the entire neighborhood in a digital packet. The evidence spoke for itself. Grainy footage of her creeping along the edge of my lawn at midnight, the matching handwriting on the anonymous flyers, the arborist's note, linking the chemical damage to the very spots she had lingered near. Each piece formed a mosaic, and the picture it revealed was undeniable. Neighbors reacted not with apathy, but with outrage. For years, Karen had hidden behind the veneer of being the enforcer of standards, the guardian of appearances. Now she was revealed as the saboteur, the one undermining the very peace she claimed to defend. Conversations shifted. Instead of whispered complaints about my tree, people openly discussed the Karen problem that had plagued the neighborhood for too long. And yet, exposure was not enough. Karen was cornered, and cornered pride can be unpredictable. I prepared for the next phase, the retaliation she would unleash when the last of her reputation crumbled. My security measures were reinforced, cameras repositioned, backups stored off-site. The lawyer, once a consultant, now became an active shield, drafting cease and desist letters and preparing injunctions. In case her sabotage escalated into outright trespassing or property damage, but I also began planning something more creative, something that would strip away the illusion she clung to. If she demanded control over privacy, then I would dismantle hers, not unlawfully, not cruelly, but with a kind of public exposure that even she couldn't twist into victory. The opportunity came with the next HOA newsletter, a routine publication that most neighbors skimmed at best. I proposed an article on community safety and property respect, complete with anonymized but unmistakable examples drawn from the incidents. The board, stung by their earlier missteps, agreed. The article didn't name Karen, but the stories, the screenshots, and the documented behaviors made her identity plain to anyone who lived within 3 streets of her. It was her mirror, held high for all to see, polished with her own actions. Karen's response was volcanic. The very day the newsletter arrived, she stormed through the neighborhood with a new fury. Confrontations erupted on sidewalks, shouted accusations of slander and conspiracies. But the more she raged, the clearer the contrast became. One side, calm, documented, methodical. The other side, shrill, unhinged, unraveling. For the first time, neighbors who had once been intimidated began pushing back. They told her to leave their porches, shut their doors in her face, and shared their own stories of grievances long buried. Her power base crumbled faster than even I had expected. The HOA board, wary of liability and embarrassed by their earlier alignment with her, began the process of censuring her formally. They reminded her of the harassment clause in the bylaws, and for once, she found herself on the receiving end of letters with official seals. She was no longer the enforcer, she was the violator. Through it all, the tree stood as silent witness. Its branches reached wider with the passing season, its leaves whispering in the wind like the quiet laughter of history. What had once been a battleground was now a monument to injustice. But I knew one thing with certainty. Karen wasn't finished. Humiliation cut steep, and even as her grip on the neighborhood loosened, her resentment grew sharper. As I stood beneath the canopy one evening, watching the sun filter through leaves that had outlived generations, I realized the final act was coming. She had been exposed publicly, stripped of her authority, and censured by the very institution she once commanded. The only question that remained was how she would lash out before the curtain fell completely and how I would meet her final strike. The storm was gathering, the tension strung tight, like a bow, and when it broke, it would decide more than just the fate of a tree. It would decide whether Karen could still haunt the neighborhood or whether she would be erased from its story entirely. The neighborhood had grown tired of Karen, but she wasn't ready to accept her fall from power. To her, the HOA's censure, the newsletter's exposure, and the loss of her social grip were not endings, they were insults stacked one upon another. Each day, she paced her yard like a restless general surveying a shrinking battlefield. Her once proud presence had transformed into a spectacle, watched with wary curiosity by the very neighbors who used to fear her. Her last attempt came not with whispers or sabotage, but with a full-blown spectacle of defiance. She filed a personal lawsuit against me, bypassing the HOA entirely, and claimed that my tree posed an imminent danger to her home and her safety. She painted herself as the victim, accused me of harassment, and argued that the board had failed in its duties. It was the culmination of her grievances, all funneled into a single desperate gamble to reclaim the authority she had lost. The lawsuit arrived like a storm warning. A thick envelope, stuffed with pages of accusations and demands, was delivered to my doorstep. But rather than striking fear, it confirmed what I already knew. Karen was throwing the last of her energy into a final offensive. This was not strategy, it was desperation dressed up in legal jargon. And desperation, when exposed, rarely survives intact. My attorney, already familiar with her antics, responded with precision. He filed countersuits for harassment and property damage, citing the evidence I had painstakingly collected over the months. The arborist's reports, the soil samples, the security footage, the flyers, all of it became ammunition. What Karen intended as a legal ambush quickly turned into a battlefield where she stood alone, stripped of allies and credibility. The court hearing was the stage where everything reached its climax. Karen arrived armed with binders, her expression taut with defiance. She spoke with the same force she had always used, but the words landed flat. Her claims were unsupported, her accusations contradicted by clear evidence. When my attorney presented the video footage of her at the edge of my property with a canister of chemicals, a silence rippled through the courtroom. The judge leaned forward, eyebrows arched, and from that moment the tide was irreversible. Karen's story collapsed under the weight of her own actions. Her lawsuit was dismissed, her credibility shredded, and the countersuits were allowed to proceed. She was ordered to pay restitution for damages, fine for harassment, and warned that further interference would bring even harsher consequences. The gavel's strike wasn't loud, but it echoed like thunder through the chambers of her pride. The aftermath was swift. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood, and the once feared enforcer became a cautionary tale. Karen retreated behind drawn curtains, her presence in community life reduced to bitter glances from a window. The HOA, eager to salvage its reputation, rewrote policies to prevent such abuse of power from ever festering again. What had once been her fiefdom was now a place where her name carried more pity than fear. As for me, I stood beneath the tree in the days that followed, feeling the steady pulse of survival beneath its bark. It had weathered not just storms of nature, but storms of pettiness, cruelty, and obsession. Where once it had been a target, it now stood as a symbol of resilience. Its roots held firm, and so did the legacy it represented. The counterattack I had envisioned was not one of destruction but of revelation. By exposing her actions, documenting her misdeeds, and refusing to bow to intimidation, I had turned the mirror back onto Karen. She had demanded control over my family tree, but in the end, it was her privacy, her reputation, and her imagined authority that had been cut down. The neighborhood, freed from her shadow, began to breathe easier. Block parties returned, laughter filled the streets, and people no longer worried about the sting of her complaints. The tree became more than a landmark, it was a reminder of what happens when truth is allowed to stand tall against lies. In the end, Karen had demanded I cut down my family tree. Instead, I cut down her power, and where her empire of intimidation had once loomed, only silence and regret remained. The story closed not with vengeance, but with restoration. The tree still grew, its branches stretching toward the sky, a living testament that sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to yield.